Hello, everybody. Welcome to another episode of Onion Soup, the show where we pull back the layers of metaphysics and reality in order to demystify spirituality. And today we have a wonderful guest, Mr. Thomas. How are you doing today?
Oh, it's great to be here, Dexter. I look forward to a conversation.
I look forward to it as well. So, you are a couples therapist, but you're also a facilitator of psychedelics. One, how did that get started?
Yes, it's an interesting question, and you are right. I trained in both these. So one in the Netherlands, and I'm also doing training with the Mind Foundation in Berlin in psychedelic integration, which is a fascinating and expanded field at the moment. But I think for my story, how I got into it was because I had a son that was really, really ill, and had what's called a life-limiting condition, and I really struggled to come to terms with these existential issues around, death and letting go, and despite all my different trainings in somatic trauma therapy, etc., I just couldn't really get to terms with it. Um, and that's kind of how I had my first experience into using psilocybin, or what's also often referred to as magic mushrooms, where I had this transcendent experience of letting go of my own body and seeing myself being dead. I drowned in that experience, but after letting go of the anxiety, which was initially was the onset, there was this overall sense of peace and calm and compassion. And then suddenly I could see myself outside all these narratives, all these normal attachments that we have. And it was a very, very fascinating experience because, as an attachment couple therapist, it's all about the opposite spectrum. It's about attachment that we need as a survival structure in this physical world, and why they're so important for our well being, and also how I help couples navigate that, right? And then there was here having to go to the completely opposite, which was letting go of all attachment to find a sense of peace and ease. And then it was a really fascinating journey afterwards to try and incorporate these and also bring that back, of how that can kind of exist, these experiences, as something useful in this lived physical experience that obviously we are having.
Wow. It's interesting that you say that you died. So, I've actually experienced, psilocybin as well, and not my first experience, but my second one, I did die.
Mhm.
And I've told people that before, and they're like, "What do you mean?" It was very transcendent. But when you're doing your couples therapy, do you utilize psilocybin in couples therapy as well?
So I don't use psilocybin in couples therapy, and I think so. There's research happening at the moment using something called MDMA. It also used to be used as ecstasy in couples therapy, and the reason that they're not looking at the more traditional psychedelics like LSD or magic mushrooms, psilocybin, is because they tend to, as you have experienced yourself, it often take you out to a different consciousness, right? And when we are having people in couples therapy, we actually want them still to stay in this consciousness, so we are able to engage with another, right? Which you can't always do probably on LSD or on psilocybin, etc. But on MDMA, you can. You tend to not have the ego death that can be associated with some of these other compounds, and you also don't kind of disappear into a different space where, for example, you have a near death experience or whatever might happen, right? Or you have interactions with other things. So you can still very much in MDMA be present. And what MDMA does is that primarily shuts down the fear response in the brain. And that suddenly means that it becomes much more accessible to be able to communicate as a couple, right? That might otherwise have been locked up in fear responses when they interact, and therefore they can't really hear each other. So MDMA is more what's being researched primarily in at the moment for couple therapy, and is showing really promising results, while psilocybin and some of these other compounds are more used for individuals or people in groups that want to do their own work and progress.
Interesting. You mentioned ego death. Can you go more into depth about what that is?
Yes, absolutely. So, and without getting into too much complicated neuroscience, then there's a certain part of our brain called the default mode network. And what that does is it construct our sense of reality, meaning it's basically like a filter that allows to decide what you are able and allowed to be aware of at any point in time. It also takes all the input that you had throughout a life and create a construct of identity of who you think that you are, because we need that to be able to navigate the world. Because if every second we had to make a new decisions and take and transport every input as new, it would be too overwhelming for the brain. So to simplify it, it creates sense of identities that create certain emotional responses, certain behaviors that we can kind of repeat again and again, right? We don't want to every time we see a door have to figure out, oh, that's a handle. So we create these patterns of what we understand as reality, right? That makes it easy and simple. However, these are also the same patterns that often keep us stuck and makes us become rigid. And this is also the part of the brain that's associated with pretty much every mental health condition, from depression, anxiety, OCD, PTSD. We see a heightened activity in this default mode network. And what we've also measured, which is super fascinating, is that on psychedelics, while the rest of the brain suddenly has an incredible spike in interconnectivity that you normally don't have in a normal state of mind, the one part of the brain that actually get less activity is a default mode network, meaning this general that decide who can speak to each other and what they communicate to each other, right? That really limits our experience of self and others and what's around us. That is shut down and silenced, which is why suddenly you can experience music in a new way. You can suddenly see totally new possibilities for what you could do with your life. You can suddenly implement new behaviors that before were not possible because you were stuck in this lack of flexibility, right? So it really expands the flexibility of the mind. And there's still this question, is what we experience an illusion? Or is it just that we are suddenly able to experience a lot more of what is, because we can access much more of that sensory experience?
Wow, that was very beautifully put. No, it's funny because when I talk to people about, awareness and conscious awareness, what I usually say is the difference between a person that's quote unquote "more aware" is just a level of awareness. Everything that exists is currently here in the now. But just like you said earlier, if we were forced to have to process every single piece of stimuli at one time, you kind
Mhm,
of go crazy.
mhm.
And as we place our judgments on type of things, that kinda help that makes us go a little crazier,
Yeah,
you know?
yes,
But
yes.
when we start looking into some of the neurological pathways that get opened up, are there any we don't know if there are any, like, chemicals in the mind that maybe help people to facilitate these connections? Is it like an increase in dopamine or oxytocin? What's really going on there?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. And there's a combination depending on the compound. So if we look at something like magic mushrooms, psilocybin, or LSD, they're very, very similar, these two, except LSD is synthesized, a drug, while psilocybin grows in nature naturally in a magic mushroom. Um, but they both primarily interact with serotonin receptors. And serotonin has a huge impact on so many different things. So the growth of brain cells, the connectedness of brain cells, our different moods. It has lots of impact. And part of what happened when we take this is not only the, you can say, the ego death, the death of that this default mode network I mentioned before, but it also spikes growth of new neurons and interconnectedness, which is why we can change really quickly. They call it neuroplasticity. It means that for a while afterwards you can form new connections, a bit like a child. We know that children have enormous plasticity in the brain, right? Which is why they adapt and learn new. Then we become more and more rigid with age. So it's almost a period of time you become a child. And this is also why I always say to people, if you're gonna do or use some of these compound, I don't know whether it's legal depending on what people are or not legal, but if they decide to use them, they should really, really plan what they do. Because there's a reason that when we have a child, that we have different limitations and say, oh, we shouldn't expose a child to that, because an open brain, that's not very good to be exposed to, right? So we are more careful and plan. And really, we should do the same when working with these compounds. Dopamine is more a reward hormone. So that's what says this is what I should seek. You see someone attractive, you get reward hormone for going up there, right? Um, and dopamine is also what's associated more with addictive behaviors, right? So dopamine is a very key element. So it's interesting that it's not the key part of most psychedelic compounds, dopamine, which is also why they tend to not be physical addictive, is what we are now discovering, right? And then the last part, which you see a big spike on, especially with MDMA, which is why it will call the love drugs, right? It's what's called oxytocin. And when mothers give birth, they have huge bursts of oxytocin because that's part of what makes them bond to the baby, right? And make sure they take care of that baby. We know that if they don't release oxytocin, they don't care that much, right? And they're probably going to neglect that baby. And with MDMA, we also see big spikes of oxytocin, which is why in couples therapy, that can allow people to come back and somehow re-noticing that connection that they had at some point, but they obviously got lost in different patterns throughout time.
Wow. So when dopamine well, I think it's really important to mention the fact that dopamine isn't something that's, associated with a lot of these psychedelics, because I feel when people talk about psychedelics, they think they're gonna get instantly addicted, and
Mhm.
that's simply not the case. It doesn't really work the same way as other illicit drugs do.
Yes,
But
that's spot on.
when serotonin increases, does that mean that the cortisol levels in a person are gonna decrease?
So I think we can't say it that simple. It's because it's not that there's one compound will instantly, because there's multiple different compounds at any point of time in your bloodstream and in your brain, right? That then influence how they regulate each other. Um, but what we do tend to see is that the fear response diminish, right? Especially with MDMA. However, with other compounds such as psilocybin or LSD, people can still have anxiety, especially in the beginning. But what that anxiety tend to be about is normally the fact that as this compound take place, we start having a sense of losing control. And part of what makes us feel safe in the physical spectrum is we are constantly seeking to be in control of our environment, right? So if people again are not prepared, and that's why again I say it's so important to prepare and not just go to some random club or festival and consume some compound, because done in that way, it can be psychologically harmful, right? Which is why it's important to have the right set and setting. But we do know done in the right set and setting, the possibility of harm is extremely, extremely low compared to the enormous benefits that we are now seeing. Um, so I think it's really about doing it in more careful, planned ways instead of, this random, spontaneous, I want to have fun, I want to get high. But you're right that they are not showing addictive properties. There are some people that keep seeking novel experiences, but they are not in themselves physically addictive, except for ketamine, which does have an addictive property in them. But magic mushrooms, for example, don't have addictive properties. And you don't have people normally when they take magic mushrooms wanting to go back and do it 2 days later again. That is pretty much unheard of. If you tried it yourself, you don't want to do it 2 days after again. Probably very happy to have a break, right? Um, so yes, and also from psilocybin, you pretty much can't overdose on it physically. Like you would probably get nauseous and just throw up before you actually could harm yourself in that way. Of course, there's certain things you have to look out for, like you shouldn't, for example, do these compounds if you're taking antidepressants because they compete for the same serotonin receptor. So there are still some planning that's good to do again, right? But if you do that, yes, it's very, very safe. And there was a lot of myths around how dangerous it was. David Knott, people can look this up. David Knott is one of the leading professors here in the UK and researchers into psychedelics. And he published a graph where he looked at the harmful compounds. Yeah. And the interesting thing, they looked both at most harmful to society and most harmful to individual. And number one, without any competition, was alcohol. Just let that sink in, because alcohol is completely legal in every culture across the globe. Was by far the most harmful substance. Yeah. LSD, I think, was the third least harmful, and magic mushrooms was very last on the list as the least harmful. They were literally measured no harmful impact to society or other people. And even the potential for harm was tiny to the individual, which primarily was people doing it in unsafe ways. So, yeah, I think that's just an important point. So, I'm happy you brought that up.
Yeah, I think it's crazy because when I've mentioned things like that to people before, I'm like, well, alcohol is so much more damaging to your body, to your
Yes.
psyche, to your friends and family. People get I mean, you die from alcohol. It literally breaks
Mhm.
down your body. and when you do psychedelics, the opposite effect happens. Your consciousness
That's
tends to
right.
open up, and you are able to perceive more around you. But as you were talking, you mentioned having the ability to really release control in order to allow the psychedelics to take effect. How does someone
Yes.
release control?
So that's a really good question. And I think, again, this is part of if you work with, so I think there's a few elements in this. So we know in traditional therapy, the most important element is not what modality it is, it's how much they trust each other, the relationship. And I think we often forget this because there's a lot of, we're springing up new retreats every week, right? Go on this ayahuasca, go on this retreat. And I think what's often missed in this is that you don't have time to build relationship with the person facilitating for you, which is super, super key. So part of being able to let go of control is to do it with someone you really, really trust. Because if you have a safe attachment there that can create safety, that will be super helpful. So for me, in my first experience that I mentioned earlier in the podcast, where I started feeling I was drowning and it felt real, right? I really felt I was struggling to breathe. And I said to him, my friend, who's also a therapist and a long term friend I trust really dearly, and he was there next to me. I said, I can't breathe. And he just put his hand on my chest and he said, your body is completely safe. Just let go of the resistance and the breath will come back, right? So he was there to create that soothing from the outside when I didn't have the perspective. So this is why having a trusted person, but had that been a stranger, my body probably wouldn't have responded in the same way, right? So I would say that's a huge key element. Bring someone that you trust that is going to be there to look out for you and care for you, right? It's also a much safer way to do it anyway. And in case you get stuck in a loop where you find it hard again, they can then try and bring you back, right? And the second part is also knowing what to expect. So some people just go get something random, have no idea what they're doing. They take it and then they suddenly get overwhelmed and they get terrified, right? If you work with someone who know what they're doing, they would have prepared you for what to expect. And they would have told you these are the steps you're gonna go through. And that means when the anxiety come, it suddenly doesn't become overwhelming because you already anticipated it. You knew it was gonna come. So it feels a bit safer, right? So I really think having a trusted, safe person and preparing and knowing what to expect are two key elements that makes it easier to let go of that control.
Well, I 100% agree with you. The first time that I tried it, actually, the first time I tried it, nothing happened.
Uh-huh.
And what I was told was that I was seeking so deeply for something to happen that nothing happened.
Uh-huh.
And I
Yes.
also took a relatively low dose. But the second time, and both times, I was around very trusted individuals, people who were experienced, and just kept me calm the whole time. I'm a pretty calm person in general.
Yes.
But definitely let me know what was happening what was gonna happen prior to and during and after and so on and so forth. But before we can dive a little bit deeper, I do wanna take a really quick commercial break. Be right back. Alright. Hello, everybody. Welcome back. So, when we were talking about doing various psychedelics, and you mentioned doing them with a friend, do you ever do them by yourself?
So, if you're asking me personally, then no, I would never do that. Again, I'm not saying that's right for everybody because we're all different, and some people might prefer, some people maybe don't have somebody they trust that they want to do it with. But I think if we're talking optimal conditions, which of course doesn't always exist, then yes, I would always do it with a trusted friend because it's invaluable to have somebody who can calm you down. It's invaluable if suddenly you do get stuck in a challenging experience, especially people who might have had severe trauma. Um, and remember, this suddenly takes away that filter, meaning there could have been trauma that was so suppressed because we weren't able to look at it and manage it that now suddenly are then exposed, right? And again, having a trusted friend there that can help you and soothe you and calm you down. And even if you prepared this, you can talk about that before, right? What soothes you down? What are some good memories you have? So I remember a friend that I helped, and I would talk to him beforehand. What are good memories you have? What are things that can bring you back? And he gave me some pictures of really good memories from his childhood, right? And when suddenly he was having a place where it became a bit too challenging, I would then just take his hand, guide him outside. So, because again, changing location and where you are can be quite helpful. I took him out into some fresh air. And then I just sat him down and showed him some of these pictures he's given me on good memories, right? And that was able to bring him back. But if I hadn't been there, he probably wouldn't have been able to do this himself, right? So that's a good example of how having a helpful friend or therapist, whatever it might be, really is so, so essential and can be so helpful.
Wow. So one other thing I want to touch on with psychedelics, a lot of people have this fear of maybe encountering another entity or like a ghost or a spirit or something like that. Have you ever experienced anything like that? Or
So I have had other people experience that. I haven't myself in my personal experiences, but I know other people that I have been with that had those experiences. And similar, I think if you're on your own, it can be very, very overwhelming, right? But if you are not on your own, then it doesn't necessarily become that overwhelming. And also because, and this is where the integration part becomes important, because if you have these experiences and you don't really know much about the psyche and you come back and you're alone with this, that can become very overwhelming, very, very disturbing, right? To try and live with that on a day-to-day basis and suddenly make sense of what is real, what's not real. And it can create a sense of confusion that can actually be very disruptive for people. But again, if you have good integration, then somebody will help you try and look at what are these symbols of, because that's often what they are. There are some symbols for something that is being communicated. It's not really about a ghost or an alien or whatever people might met. This is a symbol that their mind is creating to make sense of something else, right? But again, if you're not able to then do that, then you can be stuck in a place where you can't really make sense of reality and it becomes confusing. So, this is why, again, I think, if we do this mindfully, then it's very, very safe. And this is why, again, because you're right, a lot of people do get scared. But really, what tend to be where we see issues is when people do it mindlessly,
mm,
right? It is when they go to the club or they start mixing different compounds where they have no idea. Maybe they drink alcohol and then they buy MDMA because they want to dance, right? And then they dance for 12 hours, but they don't drink any water. This is basically what happens in the very rare, because even then it's very rare, but the few instances where people end up in hospital or get really unwell, this is what has happened, right? It's because they mix different compounds or they bought something they don't really know what it is. It could be an MDMA pill that's not pure at all, right? Because who knows if you buy it and don't test it. And then they go out and do unsafe things like dancing 12 hours without drinking water, right? Then yes, then you can overheat and that can be dangerous. So it's really just, I really encourage people to go seek a bit of knowledge before doing this, because they are safe unless you do it really carelessly. But that's the same with anything. If you drive your car 200 miles an hour without a seatbelt, well, then a car is really, really dangerous, right? Really dangerous. And if everybody did that, then we should ban cars too.
yeah.
So, but if we drive safely, we stick to approximately the speed limit, we have seatbelt on, then it's pretty safe. So it's really how we do it.
Mhm. I love that because I agree. It's all about safety and it's really about being knowledgeable going into it.
Mm.
But I really want to touch on what you said about integration and how important it is to after the after effects of the psychedelics and to
Yes.
sit down and talk about that. So for integration processes, what do you recommend?
So I think what we often forget is when we take a psychedelics is people say psychedelics heal. Psychedelics doesn't heal. Psychedelic is what's called a neurological enhancer, meaning it's almost like a boom in your brain, right? It creates a huge potential for very rapid change to take place and new perspectives to form, new emotional responses to events, new actions. However, that only happens if we integrate. Because if you go back into, let's say, a toxic environment, well, then that's what's going to be integrated, right? And this is where actually we can do more harm if we are not mindful of what we are doing. So I always tell people it's really good to at least take some days off work, right? I recommend spending some time in nature where you can really have downtime. I recommend, things like journaling and really reflecting on what happened. If you can share the experience with people who understand and accept this, it can also be really helpful to have that social element of integration. You can use art. You can use embodied practices. Like I host ecstatic dances where people can come and move with their body, with what they're experiencing. You can, of course, use traditional talk therapy. But really, what I have seen work most effective is integrating the three different layers of the brain. So we have cognition, which is talking like we do now, making logical sense. Then there's limbic, which is the layer below. That's the emotional memory storing, right? And that's processing the emotions. That could be through painting, that could be through journaling, trying to make sense of that. And then the last part is somatic, meaning the body, right? And actually, part of what really gets ignited in a lot of psychedelic experience is a new connection with the body that often is forgotten in our culture, where we very much focus on the intellect, the cognition, right? So really start noticing the body and start sitting down, taking time. When you feel stressed, say, where do I notice this in my body? Start listening, because the body is like a signaling system. And often what I see with clients who have depression, anxiety, come with all this, it's because they haven't listened to their body for so long. And what happens when you don't listen is the body has to turn up the volume until you listen. And that's when people come into the therapy room with anxiety, depression, right? They haven't listened for so long that the body actually had to make them unwell until they start listening. And as soon as we can listen earlier to the signals, the body calms down, because it's like, oh, he's listening. If I'm cold, he puts on a jacket, right? Because if we don't put on the jacket, well, then the body has to make us start shaking and freezing, right? If we don't, the body will make us sick, hoping we finally get the message before we die. And it's the same emotionally. The emotional system is exactly the same. It's basically a way that it's telling you you need to pay attention. For example, anger. People often don't like when anger comes up, right? Anger is a beautiful, healthy emotion. It's what we do with it. Anger was biologically created to tell you something is violating you that you need to pay attention to and stop. So the emotion is not good or bad. It's literally just a signal. I think the issue is we don't slow down to integrate, to then listen to those signals. And if we could do that, then we really, really benefit from these experiences.
I do wanna dive more into the emotional aspects of things because I feel that what you said was very powerful and important. How anger is a useful emotion when used properly. No emotion is good or bad.
Yes. And if you think about it like this, because we have this organism, we're built with these layers to try and help us navigate the world. So, literally, if you see everything purely as a signaling system to guide you through this world, all we have to do is actually listen. We only get into out of balance and in dysfunction when we don't listen, right? We have cognition, which is how we make logical sense of what's happening. However, the logical sense tend to, even though it's a predictive machine, it's wrong a lot of the time, right? But we have two other wonderful systems. One is bodily sensations, and we've never in our culture given them good or bad labels. Like nobody says good or bad, you're hot or cold. We just adjust, right? Okay, it's cold, I need to put a jacket on. Oh, it's hot, okay, I take my shirt off. Or whatever, we turn on the aircon. We just adjust, right? We don't say it's good or bad. Same if you're hungry or full, we don't say that's good or bad. It's just hungry means you need to eat now.
Mhm.
Full means I'm gonna stop eating. This is a body communicating to us about temperature, about blood sugar, right? And we listen. So when we listen, it works. So we often forget that emotions is the same. Except in our culture, we started labeling emotions as good or bad, meaning some emotions we try to not get in touch with. And then we ignore that signal system. That's when we get in big, big trouble, right? And we have all these emotions that, a lot of women will often say, oh, anger is bad, or some men might be afraid of their anger, right? Because they don't know what do I do with it, without realizing that this emotion is literally just telling you that there's something you have to pay attention to. And like I said, it tend to be a signal that was biologically developed to stop you from being violated or taken advantage of, right? So instead, you could just sit down and say, okay, what is it maybe that I'm doing that I don't want to be doing? Who is it maybe that I let step on me that maybe I shouldn't let step on me? And if you do that, you could journal and then you could see, okay, here is when I get triggered and feel angry. Okay, so this is what I need to put a stop to, right?
Mhm.
And now We don't have to say it's good or bad, and it doesn't come out as suddenly explosive, violent anger, because that's what happened when we don't listen to it, right? Explosive, dangerous anger is anger that has not been acknowledged for a long, long period of time. And as it builds up, the system can no longer contain it, and then it becomes dangerous, right? So anger is not dangerous. It's the lack of processing it that becomes dangerous, right? Same with sadness or grief. There's nothing dangerous about sadness. You know, you have a cry and then we come back and restabilize balance, or we grieve and have a ritual for something we might have lost, whether it was a fantasy, whether it was a partner, whatever it might be. But if we go through that process, the system can rebalance again, right? It's when we don't, then you see somebody showing up 2 years later with depression, right? Because that rebalancing of the organism didn't happen.
Yeah. Yeah, I 100% agree with you. A lot of times we don't allow ourselves to come back into, I don't really want to say hemostasis, but we don't allow ourselves to come back into balance, like you said. And when you are angry or sad, a lot of times it's m- more beneficial to, like you said, sit down and recognize why you were angry, because there
Yes,
might have been a boundary that got crossed that you didn't even realize was a boundary for you, or it might be
exactly.
time to put up a boundary for something.
Exactly. And emotions are a beautiful tool to navigate moment to moment, because even boundaries are organic, right? They're not fixed. Like maybe you want to be kissed by this person in this scenario, but not in this, right? So, and people will say, how do I know? I say, well, listen to your emotions, because your emotions will tell you minute by minute, right? It's just to slow down and pay attention. Then you do know when this is something you want and when this is not something you want. And it's even okay to change your mind, because again we have different needs. Like I'm not hungry right now, but it's okay that I'm hungry in an hour, right? I need to eat.
Right, so when you look at relationships, my dad calls it growing pains, and when you and your partner, you're not necessarily at odds with each other, but we're still growing individually as adults, and we have to be able to come together and talk about, "Okay, this was okay with me 5 years ago, but it's not okay with me now," and it's really important to establish that relationship with your partner ongoing.
Yes, I think you're spot on. And this is why, often when people, for example, get married, they have this big ceremony and then it's like, now we're together. And we often forget that it's an ongoing commitment that we make every single day, right? And it's like you have a flower, you can't water it once, and then you wonder why it's dead in a month when you haven't given it any water, right? You need to consistently do this. And same in a relationship, we are constantly changing as well as human beings. So you need to sit down and adapt to the other person, who they are, what their needs are, which are changing at any point, right? And there will be different phases in your life. At some point you maybe are giving 80% because the other person only have 20. That might then change, right? And therefore you need to have a constant set of communication where you sit down and discuss what is actually happening for you and what your needs are. And also you need to look at the needs that are not being met. Can they be met? And if they can't be met, then how can we maybe at least grieve that together, right? Because often what happens is people don't express it, and then resentment builds up, right? And or they say, oh, I'm not going to get it anyway. Well, it's true, sometimes we get our needs, sometimes we won't get them. However, even expressing them and having them acknowledged by your partner or this other person, and then being with you, sitting there saying, that really sucks, you can't have that, at least that makes you not feel alone, right? And in that you can even have connection when you can't necessarily give each other all the needs you want, instead of start disconnecting because they're not communicated, right? So there's something important in even just being able to acknowledge each other, even in the spaces where we can't meet all the needs.
Mm. I think it's really important to note that your partner probably won't meet every single need for you, and then that's okay as well. That's a lot of
Yes.
pressure to put on one person.
Absolutely. And I think, again, if you even look at the structure we live in today in our very individualistic society, right? We don't have the same tribal culture anymore. And it really used to be a tribe that supplied this, right? We had so many people around. There was one that was a funny one. There was one that was great at cooking. There was some that were good at looking out for the kids. Now we have obviously often fragmented and live further away from family and all this stuff. So now often we put all this on these two people to raise kids, to be funny, to be the one you share all your interests with, to be the one that's sexy, to be the one that provides. And like you said, it's often so unrealistic that we are bound to be disappointed. Which, but again, this is why you need to sit down and say this, right? I have a desire for this and I'm struggling. And then you can look at also together as a team, okay, how can we make sure these needs are fulfilled in different ways, right? But I think the point is to come together and try and solve things as a team, because that's what relating is about, right? Understanding the other person's world. I think the challenge happens when that doesn't happen, then there's no longer a feeling of being a team and people then start moving apart, right?
I love what you said about that's what relating is. I think people forget that relationship is a relation literally to each other,
Hmm.
and not just when I mean, obviously we're talking about a romantic relationship that goes for any relationship you have in your life. You have
Yes.
to continuously feed into that and continuously flower that plant if you want to have a healthy and booming relationship with that other individual.
Exactly. And that's why I think the plant is a great example, right? Because you can only not water the plant for so long and it will start to die. And relationships are the same. They are not, and this is, very much this Hollywood idea that, oh, we fall in love and then the movie always stops, right? And it given us this message, this feeling of falling in love somehow will make the relationship work because they were meant for each other, right? That's kind of the Hollywood idea.
Mhm.
However, it really misled us into how we are meant to engage with relationships, because falling in love is actually not hardly anything to do with love. And it's quite important to understand the difference, because when we scan brains of people who are falling in love, they actually have the same part of the brain active as people that are addicted. Yeah. And the same part of the brain that you will find if you scan somebody who has OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, which is why people falling in love say, I can't stop thinking about X, Y, and Z, right? It's actually an obsession, and it's a temporarily chemical obsession that nature created to draw us together, to mate, to have kids. And there's nothing in this biological strategy that had anything to do with making us stick together, which is why the falling in love, yes, it feels nice and, definitely enjoy it. I'm not saying we shouldn't enjoy it, but that does not create a foundation for a relationship. What we often forget in this world where we seek novelty and dopamine, right? Ooh, it has to be exciting. We forget that the foundation for relationship, any relationship by this matter, is safety.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's having a good piece of earth. If you don't have a good piece of earth and you plant the flower, if it's contaminated, the flower isn't going to, grow even if you water it every day. So you need a good piece of land with healthy earth, right? That's safe, that's consistent, that's stable, that can respond to each other, that want to get to know each other about the other person's inner world, right? Because that's what relating is. We don't have to agree with our partner. There's things I don't agree with my partner on, but that's not what it's about. It's about my curiosity of wanting to understand her world, and her curiosity about wanting to understand my world. And then being different is great. I wouldn't want to live with a copy of myself. so so it's more about that curiosity about continuously, just like you might look at a plant and think, wow, look, this is growing, look at this color, and you get fascinated by new aspects of each other.
Mhm. So, say you're in a relationship and the foundation was probably rocky to begin with, but you realize at some point that this isn't working, but you do want to continuously grow. How do you make that transition over with your partner?
So I guess number one is there has to be a willingness for both people. The good old one partner trying to change the other one in the hope that it's going to work, it's never going to work. So number one is, again, to relate. We need two people who actually want to do that and be there together to do that, right? So presuming we have that, then the first step would be, well, people could obviously get individual therapy and look at what is it they have brought in, right? Because we always bring in a history. That's inevitable in the way we behave, we respond to things. We never see what is. We see what we anticipate to see from what's happening, right? And that's why somebody might do something that trigger one person but not another, right? Because we interpret or only see what it is the brain wants us to see from that. And in that, what normally happens when people come in, like if they come into my therapy room, is we start looking at the patterns, because there's primarily three dances that people get caught in when their relationship is not working. We call them polkas, because it's kind of like, you start out falling in love, you're listening to the same tune, you're dancing, it's fun, it's cool. And then without really knowing it over time, you're listening to two different beats. So you're stepping on each other's toes. You start getting really annoyed, right? And you're not even aware because you've got headphones on. You don't even know you're listening to two different beats anymore. So we get together and look at, oh, what is the dance that's happening here? And based on attachment theory, we know that there are certain specific dances that will happen depending on the attachment styles of these two people, right? And once they can see that, we externalize the enemy. Because what happens when people come in is their partner, you are bad, oh, you did this. Their partner is the enemy. And as long as the brain is perceiving the partner as a threat, we can't get anywhere. So we say, listen, this is a pattern that's the enemy that you get stuck in, not your partner. Now they can make the pattern the enemy, right? So they come together now as a team to battle this pattern that they've been caught in. And they can now learn to recognize, oh, we're going into these attachment pattern again, the same dance. And then they learn how to understand what are the vulnerable attachment patterns that they actually need, because nobody's separate over, you know, that he didn't empty the bin, right? That's not why people actually separate. What often happens when, let's say the partner and she comes in and say, oh, he never empties a bin, what she's often communicating underneath is the attachment need. I feel alone. I don't feel that we are a team, that I get help. I feel alone. It's not about the specific action. It never is. But they will be bitching about the action, which is
Mhm.
why they're getting nowhere. If they can recognize, oh, this person feels alone, and he might also, whatever has happened, have attachment needs that are not being met. And when they're met, the nervous system calms down. And then it becomes really easy to hear each other. And then we can break the cycle, because then we can restructure these dynamics and communications to be one of what's called secure attachment, where a vulnerable need was expressed. Imagine a baby crying, right? It's vulnerable, it needs food, whatever it needs, and the parent respond. That's what created a securely attached person, right? When that didn't happen in childhood, you create anxious attachment styles, right? Because the child learn, oh, I won't be responded to, or oh, I'm on my own. So we can restructure that by now through the partner getting that responsiveness we didn't do. And that's how we reestablish safety. And from there, we can obviously add all the fun bit on top, but not before we have the safety.
Wow, I love how the foundation is all about safety because it's usually, like you said, it's not a "you didn't do the dishes" or
Yeah.
"you didn't clean properly." It's usually not that. It is the fact that one individual in the relationship feels like they're doing more than the other, and then at some point, somebody feels left out or someone gets their feelings hurt that they're alone so frequently and so often. But I wanna ask, what's the importance of working on yourself in the relationship?
I think it's so important because we always have to remember, wherever we come from, we bring a history. We bring a set of experiences that, as just part of how our nervous system and our brain works, we will project onto this person. And it's impossible not to. Like, even though I'm trained in this, I still project onto my partner. The only difference is I'm probably more aware of when I'm projecting onto my partner. And that can be really helpful, right? Because when we work on ourselves and we become aware of these repeated patterns that we have and how we project those, then that awareness means we no longer have to respond to them, right? And what I always say is, when things go wrong, it's because there's a very little gap between the emotional response and our reaction. Yeah. So what we would often work in an individual therapy is widen that gap between you have the emotion and that you respond. Because when we widen that gap, we get time to stop, to reflect, and to choose a new way to react. While if we react very quickly, we are basically into the automatic pattern that was created as a child, right? Or younger or earlier stage. So therefore, if we can slow down the reaction, we get a gap where we can create new reactions, right? So instead of straight away, for example, attacking when you feel vulnerable or hurt, if you can slow down, and you might feel angry first, you can say, oh, what was it that right there that wasn't met? What was it I actually needed? And then instead of going to tell your partner, oh, you're such an asshole, you were home late again, I can't trust you, which of course is going to have a defensive response, right? You can go say, when you came home late yesterday, I really felt you didn't care about me. And I felt really alone because I sat and waited for like 2 hours and I made dinner and I felt you didn't care about me. And that now allows also a different response from your partner because they don't feel under attack, right?
Mm.
So now we can start a new communication cycle just because we left a gap. And this is partly what you can work on when people do their own work, right? Seeing where are my projections, where are my interpretations? Because the fact that I interpret this as the person not caring about me is my interpretation. It's not reality, right? We have to separate facts from interpretation. And when we say, you don't care about me, that's an interpretation, right? We don't really know what's happening for the other person. So when I know these patterns, I might be able to say, oh, I often feel that people don't care about me when they don't do X, Y, and Z. And then I can kind of become aware of, okay, when I respond in this way and interpret things of people not caring about me, I don't need to trust that thought straight away. I can slow down and actually maybe check in. What does that mean when you're late?
Mm. So when you have those thoughts that might be a little bit more negative and nagging to self, how do you reprogram that thought, or can you replace those thoughts with something else?
Yeah, you can. So I think number one is becoming aware, right? And that's the same we did in the couple thing. First, they have to become aware of the cycle they're in. Otherwise, it's very, very hard to break something we don't even know exists or don't think exists. So there's the awareness. The second part, the gap, as I called it, creating the gap, comes down to what's called emotional regulation.
Mm,
So there's both self regulation, which is strategies where we can teach somebody how to regulate their own nervous system, and then there's co-regulation is how can their partner help them regulate, right? What can help soothe through that? That could be eye contact. That could maybe be a touch on the shoulder. Different things a partner can do to help them calm down, right? So they can regulate and they can learn different things themselves like breathing, how to use movement. I had this lady who would get anxiety attacks and then she couldn't control it, and just by her getting up and just shaking, I told her just to shake her arms and then she discharged all that adrenaline, because adrenaline wants us to move. That's why we call it fight or flight, right? It's not meant to sit and talk, it wants to move. So I got her to move her body, and in that, or the man who come home and always snap after work because he had a stressful day, I said, don't go straight home. Go some walks around the neighborhood first to discharge all that adrenaline so it doesn't go straight out on your kids and your wife, right? And by doing that, he comes home and he's a bit more regulated. And then the interaction is much more likely to have a positive outcome, right? So we teach them how to create this gap in responsiveness. And when we've done that, when they're regulated enough, then we also teach them how to see what's called faulty prediction. So, as I said, the brain is constantly trying to predict the future because that's how we create safety, right? By trying to predict what's going to happen. But very often these predictions are wrong, right? Like the person coming home late and me saying, oh, you don't care about me, right? That's trying to create safety by predicting what that would mean. However, often that's wrong. So, it's also acknowledging, oh, this was my initial thought. I'm now regulated. That doesn't mean this thought is true. It was just a thought. Yeah, and then I can instead now choose a different action because I'm regulated. We then work with people on what are different actions you can do instead. You can go check with your partner and ask them, what did that actually mean? um, you can express the impact it had on you instead of attacking them, right? Which is also very likely to create a different dynamic and cycle. So we then teach them new responses that they can do. And when that get implemented and they get positive response from their partner, that start becoming implemented in their nervous system as new responses that they can now do going forward. And the more they do that, the more that become autopilot. A bit like playing a sport in the beginning, you have to think about it a lot, right? When you've done it, however, 10,000, 15,000 hours, you don't think about how you dribble with the ball anymore. You just dribble with the ball, right?
mm.
So that's like an example of how we can do that.
So for people who are just getting started with trying to have a deeper conversational relationship with their partner, how do you open up that door?
So I think for a lot of people, it is really good to start journaling, even if they don't want to go to a therapist, because journaling helps us start spotting patterns, right? Patterns of behavior, patterns of thought, patterns of emotion that normally we tend to just forget, right? And then you can look back in your journal and see, oh, I tend. So you can, for example, start journaling when you get triggered. Go in your journal instead of yelling at your partner, go journal down what triggered me, what was the action that happened, how did I feel, how did I initially want to respond or responded if you couldn't control it? What was it underneath that I actually needed? And now you're starting to build the template, right? Where you can go through these steps and saying, I now know the trigger. So I know every time my partner go, they slam the door, right? That makes me really angry. My initial response is anger. So what's happening below that anger? Oh, my dad used to be a drunk and he would always slam the door. So it really triggers my nervous system. And what do I want to do? Well, I want to scream at my partner when that happens. What do I really need? I really need him to not slam the door, right? So now I can go to my partner instead of yelling and screaming and saying, when you slam the door, I notice it really triggers my nervous system and I get this overwhelming sense of anger that's so hard to control. Because when my dad was a child, or when I was a child, my dad would always slam the door when he was drunk. So it makes me feel really scared. And I don't know how to deal with that in any other way than getting angry. So it would really be helpful for me if you could just, close the door a bit more calmly. And look, this is much more likely to get an empathetic response, right? Than me getting out of the couch and start screaming, "Why are you such an idiot? Why do you always have to slam the door?" Right? So again, slow down. They can start journaling. What are the trigger? How do you want to respond? What is your initial emotion? And what do you actually need?
Mm. Wow. I think that's so powerful and important because one, you have to be very vulnerable to share something from your childhood and
Mhm.
also be aware enough to recognize that that trigger from your childhood brought
Yes.
up these same feelings. And you really can't do that unless you do take some time to separate and
Yes.
think about really what's going on. So there's one more thing I wanted to touch on when it comes to relationships and say if you have a heated argument and I don't know if this is good or bad, but for me and my partner, I will almost not talk to anybody when I'm angry. What
Mm.
I'll say is, you know what? I'm a little upset right now. I think I'm gonna go and leave. And
Mhm.
not like leave, but we need to table this and talk about it later when
Mhm.
emotions aren't so charged. Is
Yes.
that a beneficial thing for people to do, or does that just fester the situation?
So I think, again, of course, couples are different, but I think it can be a good strategy in a way that when emotions are very high, you're rarely going to have a good outcome in that moment because often the amygdala, the part of the brain that's responsible partly for fear, is going to hijack your brain, right? And in that place, you only have very limited options. You have fight, you have flight, you have collapse, or you have fawn, which is people pleasing. Those are basically your four options, right? Neither of them particular good, right? Are not going to lead. So you're right. You can't really get anywhere constructive until nervous systems are calmed. So the reason I say it's different from couple to couple is some couples are able to soothe together, right? And if they can do that, it's probably better they stay together. However, it's very rare when people are triggered that they can soothe each other, right? Very, very rare. So in many instances, it is better to have a little time to calm down and reflect rather than just respond straight away. You're absolutely right. I think what can be really important, especially if your partner, for example, have what's called an anxious attachment style, then they tend to can be very scared of being abandoned, right? And if somebody just say, "I'm going to leave now," when they're upset, that can really trigger them even more. Now I'm going to be abandoned. Oh, is he breaking up with me? So I think a really important element in that when you say, and it sounded like you do that, when you say, "I'm going to leave, I just need to calm down," is to say, this is when I'm going to come back, or say, I will come back again. I just need a few hours, whatever. So, because that makes it clear I'm not abandoning, I'm just reflecting, but I will come back. And in that promise is a sense of safety. Does that make sense for somebody
Yes.
who's worried about being abandoned?
Yeah, 100%. That is also the other side of that I do like to do is give me a few hours. Now, but with that being said, what is a what's an unhealthy amount of time to allow a topic or situation to remain unaddressed?
That's a good question. So, of course, we don't have any data on how many minutes exactly is not a good amount of time. However, I think what's important is to keep communication going. So even if people need a day break, then you can still check in. You can still check in and message and saying, "I'm still here. I look forward to reconnecting. I still need to figure this out." And in that check in, you're continuously establishing safety. Does that make sense? While if you just disappear and give the silent treatment, that can become very harmful. Because what happens is in the gap of silence for too long, is you leave the other person's mind to make sense and meaning of what happened. And they can now never make sense of what actually is happening, because that can only happen in communication for two people. They can only now make predictions based on old experiences. Yeah. So that means it will always be faulty, very likely, and incorrect interpretations. So to leave too much silence for too long can be very harmful. So even if people need a bit more space, and that's okay, and some people might even need a week, right? But in that, you can still be continuously communicating and say, I'm not ready to talk about this, but I really want to solve this with you. And in that, you continue to establishing that base of safety, saying, we're coming back. I'm on board. I want to solve this. I'm not leaving. I'm not running away. It's not a punishment. I just can't talk about this right now. But it's important to know also that it's not being ignored completely, right? Because that can create even further resentment or fear in the other person if it just feels like it's being put to bed, if it's something that really bothered them.
Wow. Well, I appreciate you talking about what was psychedelics and going into relationships. I'm really happy that we continued this. But that's pretty much all the time we have, and this is gonna be either broken up into 2 episodes or I usually throw the longer ones onto my YouTube channel. But, well, thank you so much for your time and for coming on. Is there anything you wanna leave with the audience before we go?
Well, if people want to know more, they can, of course, go to my website and they can check out a bit more with zencentre.com. Maybe you can put the link. I don't know if you have a description, and they can and learn more about relationships. There's also a blog, etc., where I talk more about these relational patterns and how they can engage with psychedelics in safe ways, etc. But other than that, it's been such a joy to be on your podcast, and I really enjoyed the questions.
Also, thank you so much, and thank you everybody who stuck around to listen to the entire episode. This has been a really, truly great one, and I hope it helps everybody. Alright. Well, you have a great one and enjoy the rest of your day.